The fifth house symbolizes intellect and Saturn symbolizes objectivity. So if Saturn is in the fifth house, it symbolizes objective use of intellect. So the best word to really encapsulate the full flavor of it is probably logic. The next theme again has to deal with the fifth house representing intellect, and now Saturn represents tenacity. So Saturn in the fifth is tenacious intellect. So we could maybe summarize that with the word focus or concentration. Finally, the fifth house represents affection, how you express your emotions. And Saturn represents objectivity again. It's going to impact how you love. Now, each one of these key phrases, logic, focus, and love, might have a positive or a negative spin to it, depending on how Saturn is doing in the fifth house. So with logic, for example, Saturn in the fifth house might mean you're a very rational person, or it might mean you're too rational. You're like skeptical and negative in your thinking. With focus, Saturn in the fifth house could mean you have great concentration. You're very focused. Or it could mean that you're overly focused and like unrelenting. With love, Saturn in the fifth house in a positive state, it's like objective love, not subjective love. So it's like impartial love. Or if it's negative in the fifth house, it can mean indiscriminate love. The way to figure out whether you're getting the positive characteristics of Saturn in the fifth or the negative characteristics is to know whether Saturn itself is positive or negative in that house. So I will explain how to figure that out at the end of this video. And also, if you're not the mathematical type, I figure it out for you in the reports that I offer. So if you want, you can go to my website, victicara.com, and order one of my reports, and it will tell you exactly how positive or negative, and therefore how much stress to put on either the positive or the negative traits. So we have 3 themes with 2 polarities each. Let's discuss each polarity of each theme in more detail now. First thing we said is that since the fifth house is about intellect and Saturn is about objectivity, Saturn in the fifth has a very objective or impartial intellect, which means that it's very rational. The intellect of Saturn in the fifth house has emotions well under control. It doesn't let emotions influence the intellectual processes, or how it figures things out, or how it evaluates things, or how it plans things. It's very objective in its planning and in its assessment and in its evaluation. So you can call it very rational, and you can also call it very practical. It doesn't care so much for what it likes or dislikes. It cares more about what works or doesn't work. So Saturn in the fifth house is very good for scientific thinking, logical thinking. For example, the Nobel Prize physicist Felix Bloch has Saturn in the fifth house in its own sign. So it's a very positive Saturn in the fifth house, and he's extremely good with logic and rationality. It's also conjoined K2 exactly in his case. So his logic and intellect is very good at going into the substructure, the atomic structures of things. Now let's look at the opposite end of the spectrum from this same theme. The fifth house has to do with intellect. Saturn is objective. So you should be very rational and logical, right? But a lot of times you'll find that Saturn in the fifth house people are so much logical as they are just skeptical and harsh and critical. It's that lack of emotion in the intellectual process. It can be very draining and negative feeling. So with Saturn in the fifth house, you can easily get a type of person who just doesn't like anything. So that gives them more of a slant of just finding problems everywhere, being negative, finding flaws with everything, being very difficult to satisfy, always having a critical eye, always looking at things as if they are wrong. An example of somebody with this placement is Charles Bukowski. He has Saturn in the fifth house, Virgo, which in itself is not too bad, but it's with the debilitated Venus. And the next theme is that the fifth house has to do with intellect, and Saturn has to do with tenacity. It's got a great longevity. So Saturn in the fifth house, therefore, should give you a great amount of focus. It should give you a very long attention span. So these are the kind of people that study really well, learn really well because they focus for a long time and they don't get distracted. Saturn in the fifth house also helps you be the type of person who does get things done. You don't stop or get distracted midway through. Also, Saturn in the fifth house can be very useful for being the person who doesn't forget things. Now, exactly what kind of things you don't forget has a lot to do with the rest of the chart and how it's affecting Saturn in the fifth house. But the idea of a tenacious or long-lasting intellect, Saturn in the fifth house, implies that it has an effect on memory as well because you're paying a lot of attention. So therefore, you store the memories more deeply. An example to illustrate this would be Walt Disney, like a perfectionist type of person. And he does indeed have Saturn in the fifth house in its own sign. It's with a bunch of other planets too, so it's a bit complicated, and his chart overall is a bit complicated. But one of the strong parts of it is Saturn in the fifth house in its own sign. The negative permutation of this same dynamic is just to be unrelenting. So you just tenacious focus. If that's negative, it just means you're like unrelenting. You like don't give a break to anybody. Really unforgiving, really a stickler, harsh and pushing on every little point. And there's an interesting effect on memory. As we just said, Saturn in the fifth house should result in a very strong memory or lasting memory. However, if it's negative in the fifth house, it's not that it gives you a bad memory, but it's the hyper focus of memory so that you will intensely remember certain things but completely ignore other things. Things that most people remember, you're completely oblivious to, but you're remembering some detail that you happen to focus on. And that's the same way that you're conducting your intelligence in general, is you're hyper-focused on some particular thing that in the big picture probably isn't really that important, but you are so fixated on it and you won't relent from that fixation. Right. An example of a person who illustrates this is Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister. He has Saturn in the fifth house in Sagittarius, which might not seem to be entirely negative at first, but it's at exactly 0 degrees in Sagittarius, and Jupiter also is at exactly 0 degrees, and a bunch of planets in this chart are messed up, and the chart itself is very nodal. It's Ketu-ish and Rahu-ish. The third theme of Saturn in the fifth house is impartial love. A planet in the fifth house is going to affect how you express affection because the fifth house has to do with affection. Saturn is objective. So Saturn in the fifth house indicates impartial affection. The positive slant on that is you are open to love anybody. Your arms are open. You're welcoming to many people. You don't have prejudice really. And you like to extend your affection not just to a particular person, but to society in general or to people in general. An example here is probably Priyanka Chopra. You'll notice she has Saturn in the fifth house, exalted in Libra. And she's a very philanthropic and generally affectionately inclined person. It is with Mars there in the fifth house, so it might not be the ideal example, but she sure is a great example of that impartial affection. The flip side of impartial affection is indiscriminate affection. Positive Saturn in the fifth house, you love everybody. Negative Saturn in the fifth house, you love anybody. Now, positive Saturn in the fifth house is not discriminating in how it loves. And that's a good thing. A negative Saturn in the fifth house is also not discriminating in how it loves, but it's not a good thing. So it's just kind of like very hungry for affection all the time, and therefore getting involved in relationships that really aren't that meaningful. Maybe we can use Janis Joplin as a great example of this. The more positive Saturn is in the fifth house, the more rational, practical, and logical you are, the more focused, attentive, and strong-memoried you are, and the more impartial you are in how you love. However, on the flip side, the more negative Saturn is in the fifth house, the more skeptical and critical you are, the more unrelenting and intense you are, and the more you are indiscriminate in how you love. So as you see, the interpretation of any planet in any house really depends an awful lot on the positivity or negativity of that planet. So now let's go over how you would figure that out. First of all, the most basic consideration is the sign dignity. I've recently published 3 or 4 videos on this exact topic. Saturn in the first house in Aries is not the same as Saturn in the first house in Libra, and it would be ridiculous to think that it is. It's because Saturn in Aries is in fall and Saturn in Libra is exalted. And there's this whole spectrum of dignity in between exaltation and fall. And if you want to know that in detail, check those videos to figure out how you calculate dignity. In addition to the sign dignity that a planet has in a house, you also want to think about how the house itself is either advantageous or deleterious to the planet's dignity. If the planet is a malefic or the sun or the nodes, then it is at an advantage if it's in houses 3, 6, 10, or 11, but it's in a disadvantage if it's in 1, 4, 5, or 9. And if it's at an advantage, you just give a bonus to its dignity. I give 25%. And if it's at a disadvantage, you subtract some of its dignity. I subtract 25%. If it's one of the other planets, the benefics, along with the moon or Mercury, then the advantageous or bonus houses are 1, 4, 5, 9, and 10, and the disadvantageous houses are 3 and 6. Finally, the third step is to consider the lordship of this planet. If a planet is the lord of certain houses, then it gets a bonus to its dignity. If it's the lord of other houses, then it might get a detriment. So the best house to be the lord of is the first, because the lord of the first wants to protect the whole chart because the whole chart belongs to it. Also, it's very positive to be the lord of a trine, the 5th or the 9th. And it's also somewhat positive to be the lord of the 4th or the 10th. It's disadvantageous, however, to be the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th. There's a loophole about this. If the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th is occupying the 6th, 8th, or 12th, then it's not a disadvantageous thing. It's an advantageous thing. And what you would subtract, you instead add to the dignity. So if it's confusing, or you just want to see exactly how I do it, don't worry. You can do that. You can go to my website, victicara.com, click into the report section, and then you have an option to get either just the basic chart, or you can also get the subdivisions. So please consider doing that. And also, please, if you haven't subscribed, subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, leave me a comment, let me know what you're thinking. Also, just you doing that helps YouTube spot this video and show it to other people. So I really appreciate that. Thank you very much.